Martha of Harlan, granny who fed 19. Revenue men to her prize hogs after they burned her still. The most terrifying disappearance of federal agents in American history and the most complete consumption of evidence that the Appalachian Mountains had ever witnessed, when a grandmother used her prize hogs to eliminate every trace of the 19 revenue men who had burned her still with her grandson inside. This is the true story of Martha of Harlan. Our story begins in the remote mountain section of Harlan County, Kentucky, in the heart of the coal country that would become known as Bloody Harlan for the violence that marked its labor disputes, in a hollow so isolated that the federal government's authority had never truly reached it, despite the laws that claimed otherwise. The mountains rise here in great folds of sandstone and coal-bearing shale, their hollows sheltering families who had lived according to their own laws since before Kentucky was a state, who had never accepted the authority of a government they viewed as foreign and hostile, who maintained traditions that outsiders believed had ended with prohibition, but that continued in defiance of every law enforcement effort. You see, in Harlan County during the years of our story, the moonshine trade that the federal government was determined to eliminate was not merely an illegal business, but was a way of life that had sustained mountain families for generations, a tradition that predated the laws that made it criminal, a source of income that the legitimate economy had never provided, and never would. The families who ran these operations were not criminals in any meaningful sense, but were carrying on practices that their great-grandparents had carried on, were providing for their families in the only way the mountains had ever allowed, were maintaining a culture that the government seemed determined to destroy. The woman at the center of our story was known throughout the Kentucky mountains simply as Martha of Harlan, though her full name was Martha Elizabeth Blackwood, and she had been born Martha Elizabeth Combs in 1867 in a cabin on the upper reaches of Clover Fork. She had married Ezekiel Blackwood when she was 17, had borne him 12 children of whom 9 survived to adulthood, had buried him in 1919 when the influenza pandemic took him along with millions of others, and had spent the years since his death running the moonshine operation that had supported their family for 4 generations. That's right. Martha Blackwood was 62 years old in the summer of 1929, a woman whose body had been hardened by decades of mountain labor rather than bent by it, whose eyes retained a sharpness that observers found unsettling, a clarity that suggested she saw more than most people and remembered everything she saw. She had grey hair that she kept pulled back in a bun beneath a bonnet she wore in the old style, hands that were rough from work but still capable of the precise measurements that moonshine production required, a voice that carried the authority of someone who had survived everything the mountains could throw at her and had emerged stronger rather than weaker. Her operation was substantial by the standards of mountain moonshine, 3 copper stills that her husband had built before his death and that she had maintained with a craftsmanship that matched his own, producing perhaps 100 gallons of whiskey per week during the active season, supplying a network of buyers that extended from the coalfields of eastern Kentucky to the cities of the Midwest. The quality of her product was legendary, the result of techniques passed down through 4 generations and of the particular water that flowed from springs on her property, water that old-timers swore had qualities that no other source could match. But the feature of the Blackwood property that distinguished it from other moonshine operations was the hogs. Martha raised prize hogs, enormous animals that she had bred for size and appetite over more than 30 years, creatures that weighed 600 pounds or more and that would eat anything placed before them with an efficiency that farmers throughout the region admired and envied. The hogs were her secondary business, sold at markets throughout the county and known for the quality of their meat, a legitimate enterprise that provided cover for the less legitimate operation that actually supported her family. The hogs were kept in a compound behind her cabin, a fenced area that contained shelters and feeding troughs, and the infrastructure necessary to maintain a herd of such size. The compound held perhaps 40 animals at any given time, the breeding sows and the boars and the young pigs that would be raised for sale or for slaughter. The sounds and smells of the compound were constant features of life on the Blackwood property, so familiar to Martha and her family that they barely noticed them, so unremarkable that no visitor would think to question their presence. What visitors did not know What no one outside the family understood until the events of our story made it impossible to ignore was that hogs would eat anything. The omnivorous appetite of swine was well known to farmers, their ability to consume scraps and waste that other animals would reject, making them valuable converters of refuse into meat. But the full extent of what hogs would consume, the completeness with which they could eliminate organic matter of any kind, was knowledge that Martha would put to use in ways that no one had anticipated. The household that Martha maintained in 1929 consisted of herself and the extended family that mountain tradition gathered under a single matriarch's authority. Her surviving children had built cabins nearby, had raised families of their own, while remaining connected to the operation that supported them all, had created a compound of Blackwood households that functioned as a single economic and social unit. But the member of the household who mattered most to Martha was her grandson, a boy named Samuel who was 14 years old and who was the son of her youngest daughter, Mary, who had died in childbirth 3 years before. Samuel had been raised by his grandmother since his mother's death, his father having disappeared into the coalfields and never returned, his care falling to the woman whose authority over the family was absolute and whose love for her grandchildren was the emotional center of her life. He was a bright boy, curious about everything, helpful with the work that the property required, possessed of a gentleness that seemed at odds with the hard world into which he had been born. Martha saw in him the future of the family, the next generation that would carry on the traditions she had inherited and that she was determined to preserve. Samuel had learned the moonshine trade from his grandmother, had helped with every aspect of the operation, from gathering the corn to tending the fire, to running the still that produced the whiskey. He was too young to do the heavy work alone, but was old enough to be useful, old enough to understand what they were doing and why it mattered, old enough to appreciate the skill that distinguished Blackwood whiskey from the inferior product that others produced. Martha had begun teaching him the secrets that her husband had taught her, the techniques that made the difference between good whiskey and great whiskey, the knowledge that would allow him to carry on the family tradition when she was gone. The events that would transform Martha from moonshiner to avenger began in the summer of 1929, during a period of intensified federal enforcement that had brought revenue agents into Harlan County in unprecedented numbers. The Prohibition Bureau had received additional funding and had recruited additional agents, had launched a campaign to eliminate illegal distilling throughout the Appalachian region, had targeted Harlan County specifically because of its reputation as one of the most productive moonshine regions in the country. The revenue agents who came to Harlan County that summer were not the experienced lawmen who had enforced federal authority in earlier decades, but were new recruits, many of them from outside the region, all of them possessed of an enthusiasm that their limited training had done nothing to temper. They viewed the mountain people as criminals to be suppressed rather than citizens to be served, approached their work with an aggression that reflected their contempt for the communities they were supposed to be policing, used tactics that had more in common with military operations than with law enforcement. The leader of the enforcement team that would become the focus of our story was a man named Vernon Crawford, a revenue agent from Ohio whose hatred of moonshiners had been cultivated through years of frustration at the difficulty of eliminating them. Crawford had built his reputation on his willingness to use whatever methods were necessary to destroy illegal stills, had earned promotions through a record of seizures and arrests that his superiors found impressive, had developed an approach to enforcement that treated the mountain people as enemies to be defeated, rather than laws to be enforced. Crawford brought with him a team of 18 agents, all of them sharing his attitudes and his methods, all of them eager to prove themselves in the campaign that their superiors had launched. They were young men mostly, in their 20s and 30s, possessed of a confidence that their firearms and their badges gave them, certain that they were on the right side of the law, and that anyone who opposed them deserved whatever treatment they received. The raid on the Blackwood property was planned with a thoroughness that reflected Crawford's experience and his determination to make an example of one of Harlan County's most productive moonshine operations. Intelligence had been gathered over months, the location of the stills had been identified through surveillance and informants. The decision to raid had been made at the highest levels of the Prohibition Bureau's regional hierarchy. Crawford intended not merely to seize the stills, but to destroy them, not merely to arrest the operators, but to send a message that would discourage others from continuing the trade. The raid came on the morning of July 15, 1929, in the pre-dawn hours when Crawford believed the property would be least defended and the operators most vulnerable. His team approached from multiple directions, surrounded the cabin and the outbuildings where the stills were housed, prepared to move in with the overwhelming force that Crawford preferred for such operations. What Crawford did not know, what his surveillance had failed to reveal, was that Samuel had been sleeping in the still house that night. The boy had been tending the fire that kept the mash warm, had fallen asleep in the corner where he sometimes rested when the work required overnight attention, had been there when the agents surrounded the building, and had remained there when they began their assault. The agents who entered the still house did so with weapons drawn, prepared for resistance that never came. They found the stills that they had come to destroy, the copper and the coils and the barrels of mash that represented the Blackwood operation's productive capacity. They also found Samuel, the 14-year-old boy who had awakened to find himself surrounded by armed men in the darkness. What happened next would be disputed for decades, the agents claiming that they had not known the boy was there, that the fire that destroyed the still house was an accident, that Samuel's death was an unintended consequence of a legitimate law enforcement operation. The community believed something different entirely. According to the witnesses who would later provide accounts that no official investigation ever acknowledged, Crawford ordered his men to burn the still house immediately upon discovering what it contained. The order was given despite the presence of the boy, despite the agent's knowledge that Samuel was inside, despite the basic humanity that should have required them to remove a child before setting fire to the building where he stood. Crawford wanted to send a message, wanted to demonstrate that the Prohibition Bureau would show no mercy to moonshiners, wanted to make an example that would terrify others into abandoning the trade. The fire spread quickly through the still house, the alcohol and the wooden construction combining to create an inferno that consumed the building within minutes. Samuel's screams were heard by family members in the nearby cabins, by Martha herself, who had awakened to the sounds of the raid and had emerged from her cabin in time to see the flames rising from the building, where her grandson had been sleeping. The boy's screams lasted for what witnesses described as an eternity, but what was probably less than 2 minutes, the sound of a child burning alive carrying across the hollow with a clarity that made it impossible to ignore. Those who heard it would never forget the sound, would hear it in their dreams for years afterward, would find themselves unable to describe it to others because the words did not exist for such horror. Martha ran toward the still house, her 62-year-old body moving with a speed that should have been impossible, her voice screaming Samuel's name with a desperation that matched his screaming from within. She reached the edge of the fire before the agents could stop her, felt the heat searing her face and arms, would have entered the inferno if 2 agents had not grabbed her and dragged her back. She tried to reach him, tried to push through the cordon of agents who surrounded the burning building, screamed his name as the flames rose higher and the structure began to collapse. The agents held her back, prevented her from entering the inferno that was consuming her grandson, watched as the building fell in upon itself, and the screaming stopped with an abruptness that told everyone present that Samuel was gone. The silence that followed Samuel's final scream was worse than the screaming had been. Martha stopped struggling against the agents who held her, stopped screaming, stood motionless as the building collapsed and the flames rose higher, and the last traces of her grandson's life were consumed by fire. She did not weep, did not speak, showed nothing on her face that the agents could read. The stillness was more terrifying than any display of grief could have been. Crawford watched from a distance, his face showing no sign of remorse for what he had ordered. He had achieved his objective, had destroyed the Blackwood still, had sent the message that he had intended to send. The death of the boy was, from his perspective, an acceptable cost of the operation, a consequence that the moonshiners had brought upon themselves by refusing to comply with the law. He felt no guilt, no sympathy, no awareness that what he had done was anything other than effective enforcement of federal authority. The other agents showed varying degrees of discomfort, some avoiding eye contact with Martha and her family, others showing on their faces the knowledge that what they had participated in was wrong. But none of them spoke against Crawford, none of them objected to what had been done. None of them showed the courage that would have been required to acknowledge that burning a child alive was not an acceptable method of law enforcement. The boy's body was recovered from the ashes the following day, burned beyond recognition, identifiable only by the pocket knife that Martha had given him for his 14th birthday, and that had survived the flames that had consumed everything else. The knife was found clutched in what remained of his hand, as though he had been holding it when the fire reached him, as though he had been trying to use it to escape the building that had become his tomb. The official investigation into Samuel's death concluded that the agents had not known he was in the building when they set the fire, that his death was an accident that no one had intended, that the men responsible bore no criminal culpability for what had happened. Crawford and his agents were not charged with any crime, were not even disciplined within the Bureau's structure, were allowed to continue their work as though they had done nothing wrong. Martha buried her grandson in the church cemetery 3 days after his death, laid his small body in ground beside his mother and his great-grandfather, and the generations of Blackwoods who had lived and died in these mountains. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people from throughout the region, neighbors and customers and family members who came to pay their respects and to witness the grief of a woman who had lost the child she had raised as her own. She received their condolences with a composure that some found admirable and others found disturbing, a stillness that suggested not the absence of emotion but its concentration into something too intense for ordinary expression. Those who knew her well saw something in her eyes that they had never seen before, a coldness that had replaced the warmth that had always characterized her, a calculation that seemed to be measuring and planning even as she accepted the sympathy of those who had come to mourn. The planning began immediately, though Martha gave no outward sign of what she was preparing. She knew that Crawford and his agents would return to Harlan County, would continue their campaign against the Moonshiners, would eventually come back to the Blackwood property to ensure that the operation they had destroyed did not resume. She knew their faces, had memorized them during the morning when they had held her back while her grandson burned, had identified each of the 19 men who had participated in the raid that had killed him. The method she chose was one that only she could have employed, that required the resources she had spent 30 years developing, that would eliminate not merely the men who had killed Samuel, but every trace that they had ever existed. She would use the hogs, the prize animals that she had bred for size and appetite, the creatures whose capacity for consumption she understood better than anyone else in the county. The hogs would eat anything. This was knowledge that farmers had always possessed, the omnivorous nature of swine being one of their most useful characteristics. But Martha understood the full implications of this knowledge in ways that others did not, had observed over 30 years of raising hogs exactly what they were capable of consuming and how completely they could eliminate whatever was placed before them. A full-grown hog could consume several pounds of material per day. A herd of 40 hogs, properly managed, could consume several hundred pounds. Over time, with patience and planning, a herd of hogs could eliminate anything. The understanding had developed gradually over the decades of Martha's hog-raising career. She had watched the animals consume scraps and waste that other livestock would reject, had observed how thoroughly they could process bone and gristle and everything else that slaughtering operations produced. She had noted occasions when sick animals had died in the pens and had been partially consumed by their companions before the bodies could be removed. She had understood, without ever thinking consciously about the implications, that hogs represented a biological processing system of remarkable efficiency. The darker applications of this knowledge did not occur to her until Samuel's death forced her to consider methods of vengeance that would leave no evidence for investigators to find. Once the connection was made, the logic was inescapable. The hogs could eliminate bodies as thoroughly as any crematorium, could convert human remains into meat that would attract no suspicion, could provide a disposal method that no investigation could penetrate, because there would be nothing left to investigate. The preparation of her weapon occupied the weeks between Samuel's funeral and the opportunity to use it. She increased the size of her herd, purchasing additional animals from farmers throughout the county, building her population to nearly 60 hogs, whose combined appetite could consume extraordinary quantities of material. She selected for size and appetite, choosing the largest and hungriest animals she could find, building a herd that could process what she intended to feed them, with maximum efficiency. She experimented with techniques for preparing what she would feed them, learned through trial and error how to maximize the efficiency of their consumption, developed methods that would allow the hogs to eliminate all traces of what they were given. The experiments began with animal carcasses, deer and pigs, that she obtained from various sources, testing how thoroughly the hogs could consume different types of material under different conditions. The research was grim but necessary. She learned that hogs would consume bone as readily as flesh if the bones were properly prepared, that crushing or breaking bones into smaller pieces allowed the hogs to digest them completely. She learned that hogs would consume hair and teeth and everything else that a human body contained, that the only traces that might survive were items made of metal or other materials that the digestive system could not process. She learned that the process took time but was remarkably complete, that a body fed to hogs over the course of several days would leave virtually nothing behind. She developed a processing protocol that she would follow for each victim. The body would first be bled, the blood mixed with feed to encourage the hog's appetite. The flesh would be separated from the bones and fed in manageable portions over the course of several days. The bones would be crushed with sledgehammers, reduced to fragments small enough for the hogs to consume, mixed with feed that disguised their nature. The process required time and labor, but produced results that were nearly perfect. The only elements that would remain were metal objects that the hogs could not digest. Badges, belt buckles, buttons, guns, ammunition, wedding rings, pocket watches, the incidental metal that every person carried. Martha planned to collect these items and bury them in locations that would never be discovered, eliminating the last traces of the men who would otherwise have simply disappeared. The opportunity came gradually, as Martha had known it would. Crawford and his agents continued their campaign through the summer and fall of 1929, conducting raids throughout Harlan County, destroying stills and arresting moonshiners, building a record that their superiors found impressive. They worked in groups of varying sizes, sometimes the full team of 19, and sometimes smaller detachments, their movements unpredictable but their presence in the county constant. Martha watched and waited, gathering intelligence through the network that had always supported her moonshine operation, learning the patterns of the agents' movements, identifying the vulnerabilities that would allow her to reach them. The community that had protected her business for decades now redirected its capabilities toward a different purpose, providing information about the agents' locations and schedules, creating opportunities for Martha to act without being detected. The first killing came in September of 1929, 2 months after Samuel's death. The target was one of the agents who had been particularly active during the raid, a man named Dale Tackett, who had been among those holding Martha back while her grandson burned. Tackett had been assigned to patrol a section of the county alone, a routine assignment that separated him from his colleagues and made him vulnerable in ways that grouped agents were not. Martha's son Ezekiel Jr. intercepted Tackett on a remote section of road, used a story about a still location to lure him into the woods where Martha waited. The agent followed eagerly, believing that he was about to make an arrest that would enhance his reputation, not understanding that he was walking into a trap from which there would be no escape. The killing was quick and efficient, a rifle shot from cover that dropped Tackett before he could understand what was happening. Martha emerged from hiding to confirm the kill, stood over the body of one of the men who had killed her grandson, felt nothing but satisfaction at what she had done and anticipation of what remained to be done. The disposal required care and time. Tackett's body was transported to the Blackwood property under cover of darkness, was prepared according to the methods that Martha had developed, was fed to the hogs over the course of 3 days. The process was methodical and complete, every trace of the agent eliminated by the animals whose appetite Martha had cultivated for exactly this purpose. When the hogs were finished, nothing remained of Dale Tackett except his badge and his gun, which Martha buried in a location that would never be discovered. The second killing came 2 weeks later. Another agent separated from his colleagues, another ambush in the remote sections of the county that the Blackwood family knew better than any map could reveal. This victim, Robert Lawson, died as Tackett had died, his body disposed of through the same method, his existence erased as completely as though he had never lived. The disappearances began to attract attention after the third and fourth killings, the pattern of agents vanishing without trace, too consistent to be coincidental. The Prohibition Bureau launched an investigation, sent additional agents to determine what was happening to their men, increased security around the personnel who remained. But the investigation found nothing. The additional agents only increased the number of potential targets, and the security measures proved inadequate against an enemy who knew the terrain and who had the patience to wait for the right opportunities. That's right. Martha continued her campaign through the fall of 1929 and into the winter that followed, claiming victims with a regularity that reflected her patience and her skill. The fifth agent disappeared in October, the 6th and 7th in November, the 8th and 9th before Christmas. Each vanished without trace. Each was processed through the hogs that Martha had prepared for exactly this purpose. Each was eliminated so completely that the investigation could find no evidence of what had happened to them. The method's genius lay in its completeness. Other forms of murder left bodies that could be discovered, evidence that could be analyzed, clues that could lead investigators toward the perpetrator. Martha's method left nothing. The agents simply vanished, their bodies consumed by animals whose nature made such consumption unremarkable. The evidence of their deaths converted into pork that would be sold at markets throughout the county without anyone suspecting what it had been before. The investigation intensified as the disappearances continued. Federal resources pouring into Harlan County as the Bureau desperately sought to determine what was happening to its agents. Investigators interviewed hundreds of people, searched dozens of properties, pursued every lead that seemed to offer any hope of explanation. They found nothing. The wall of silence that the mountain community had maintained for generations now protected something far more serious than moonshine, the conspiracy of concealment extending to include murder on a scale that the investigators could barely comprehend. Crawford himself grew increasingly paranoid as his agents disappeared one by one, the pattern impossible to miss, even if its cause remained unknown. He suspected that the moonshiners were responsible, suspected that the Blackwood family in particular had reason to seek revenge, but he could prove nothing, and his superiors could authorize nothing based on suspicion alone. He increased his own security, traveled only with multiple agents, avoided the remote sections of the county where so many of his men had vanished. His precautions only delayed the inevitable. Martha was patient, could wait as long as necessary for the opportunities she needed, could adjust her methods to accommodate the changing circumstances that Crawford's caution created. When taking agents one at a time became too difficult, she began taking them in pairs, her sons and grandsons providing the additional manpower needed for more complex operations. The 10th and 11th agents disappeared together, the 12th and 13th shortly after, each pair processed through the hogs with the same thoroughness that had characterized the earlier killings. The 14th, 15th, and 16th agents disappeared in a single operation that demonstrated the Blackwood family's capacity for coordinated action. The three men had been traveling together, believing that their numbers provided safety, not understanding that the family they were pursuing had the capability to overwhelm them, regardless of how many agents traveled as a group. They were ambushed on a road that ran through Blackwood territory, killed in an action that lasted less than a minute, their bodies transported to the hog compound and processed over the following week. By spring of 1930, only Crawford and two of his original agents remained alive, the other 16 having vanished without trace over the course of 8 months. The Bureau had effectively abandoned its Harlan County operation, the losses too severe to justify continued enforcement, the mystery of the disappearances too disturbing to ignore. Crawford himself had been ordered to withdraw, to abandon the campaign that had cost so many lives, to accept that whatever was happening in Harlan County was beyond the Bureau's capacity to address. But Crawford could not leave, could not accept that the moonshiners had defeated him, could not abandon the vendetta that had become the defining purpose of his life. He remained in the county with his two surviving agents, continued his investigation, despite orders to withdraw, pursued leads that his superiors had told him to abandon. His determination would prove to be his undoing. The final operation came on the night of May 15, 1930, the anniversary of Samuel's death. Martha had been planning for this night for months, had arranged the circumstances that would bring Crawford and his remaining agents to a location where they could be reached, had prepared the resources that would allow her to complete the work she had begun nearly a year before. The trap was baited with information about a new Blackwood still, intelligence that Martha had allowed to reach Crawford through channels that he believed were reliable. The information suggested that the family had resumed operations, that a major still was operating in a remote hollow, that a raid could destroy the operation and perhaps provide evidence about the disappearances that Crawford was still investigating. Crawford could not resist. The opportunity was too good to ignore. He gathered his 2 remaining agents and led them into the hollow where Martha had said the still would be found, walked into an ambush that had been prepared by every able-bodied member of the Blackwood family, died in a crossfire that left no survivors among the agents who had killed Samuel 10 months before. Martha stood over Crawford's body as she had stood over Tackett's body 8 months earlier, looked down at the man who had ordered her grandson burned alive, felt the satisfaction of completion that she had been anticipating since the moment she had watched the still house fall. "This is for Samuel," she said, her voice carrying across the hollow to the family members who had participated in the ambush. Every one of them for Samuel. The final 3 bodies were processed through the hogs over the following week, Crawford and his agents joining their 16 colleagues in the oblivion that Martha's method provided. When the hogs were finished, nothing remained of the 19 revenue men who had raided the Blackwood property 10 months before. They had simply vanished, their bodies converted into meat that would be sold at markets throughout the county, the evidence of their deaths eliminated as completely as any evidence had ever been eliminated. The investigation that followed was the most extensive in the history of federal law enforcement in Appalachia. Dozens of agents were assigned to determine what had happened to their 19 colleagues. Hundreds of interviews were conducted. Thousands of man-hours were devoted to solving a mystery that seemed to defy explanation. The investigation focused heavily on the Blackwood family, the motive being obvious to anyone who knew the history, the suspicion being overwhelming, even if the evidence was non-existent. Martha was questioned repeatedly, her alibi scrutinized, her property searched multiple times. The investigators found nothing. The hogs that had consumed the agents were indistinguishable from any other hogs. The pens that had held them during the processing showed no signs of anything unusual. The evidence that might have convicted Martha had been converted into bacon and ham and pork chops that had been consumed by buyers who had no idea what they were eating. The absence of bodies was the investigation's fundamental problem. Without bodies, there was no proof that the agents were dead rather than merely missing. Without bodies, there was no evidence of how they had died or who had killed them. Without bodies, there was nothing that could support prosecution even against suspects whose motive was as clear as Martha Blackwood's. The case was never officially solved, the disappearances attributed to unknown causes. The files closed without charges being filed against anyone. The Bureau eventually concluded that the agents had been killed by moonshiners seeking revenge for enforcement actions, but without evidence to identify specific perpetrators, no prosecution was possible. Martha Blackwood lived for another 18 years after the killings, dying in 1948 at the age of 81, her death coming peacefully in the cabin where she had lived most of her life and where 19 revenue agents had been prepared for consumption by her prize hogs. She continued to raise hogs until her final years, continued to sell them at markets throughout the county, continued to be respected by a community that knew what she had done and that would never betray her. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people from throughout the mountain communities, neighbors and customers and descendants who came to honor a woman they remembered as the matriarch, who had protected her family against every threat, whose single campaign of violence they understood as a response to a wrong that demanded response, whose life could not be reduced to a single year of killings no matter how terrible that year had been. Her grave lies in the church cemetery beside her husband and her daughter and her grandson Samuel, the 4 of them united in death as they had been connected in life. The inscription on her stone gives no hint of what she did in the year following Samuel's death, bearing only her name and her dates and a phrase that the community chose to remember her by. She fed her family. The words acknowledge her role as provider without specifying all the ways in which she had provided. a memorial that those who know the story understand and those who do not can interpret innocently. Samuel's grave beside hers bears an inscription that acknowledges his fate more directly. Taken by fire, avenged by love. The words speak to those who know the story, who understand that the grandmother who lies beside him had killed 19 men in response to his death, who appreciate that her vengeance was as complete as her grief had been profound. The site where the hogs consumed the agents has been incorporated into the modern Blackwood property, the original pens long since replaced by more modern facilities, the location still used for raising the hogs that remain a family tradition. Some visitors claim to feel something unusual at the site, a heaviness that lingers in places where terrible things have happened, though such claims may reflect expectation as much as experience. The legal aftermath of the Blackwood case was significant despite the failure to prosecute. The disappearance of 19 agents in a single county prompted a complete reorganization of prohibition enforcement in Appalachia, a recognition that the tactics that had been employed were not merely ineffective, but were actively counterproductive. The Bureau reduced its presence in Harlan County, abandoned the aggressive approach that Crawford had championed, effectively conceded that the mountain communities could not be policed through force alone. The broader impact of the case extended beyond the specific reforms it prompted. The story of Martha of Harlan and her prize hogs entered the folklore of the region, becoming a cautionary tale about the consequences of underestimating the mountain people and their capacity for response. Federal agents who operated in Appalachia in the decades that followed were aware of the story, understood its implications, approached their work with a caution that reflected the knowledge that the communities they policed had their own ways of achieving justice. The hogs themselves became legendary, their role in the disappearances transforming them from ordinary farm animals into something approaching mythological creatures. Stories circulated about their size and their appetite, about the completeness with which they could eliminate what they were fed, about the method that Martha had developed for using them as instruments of disposal. Some of these stories were exaggerated, the product of fear and imagination working together. Others were entirely accurate, the reality of what the hogs had done requiring no embellishment. The songs that emerged from the Martha of Harlan story were unlike any others in the Appalachian tradition, their subject matter requiring melodies and lyrics that captured something unprecedented in the region's history of violence. The most popular ballad told the story from beginning to end, from the Moonshine operation and the prize hogs, through the raid and Samuel's death, to the killings and the disposal method that had made prosecution impossible. The first verse described Martha as she had been before the tragedy, a grandmother running a moonshine operation that had supported her family for 4 generations, her prize hogs grazing in the compound behind her cabin. The melody was almost pastoral, suggesting a life that was hard but sustainable, a world that was about to be destroyed by forces it could not control. The second verse described Samuel, the 14-year-old grandson who had been learning the family trade, who had fallen asleep in the still house on the night that would end his life. The melody became tender here, the notes carrying the affection of a grandmother for the child she had raised, the loss that was coming making the tenderness almost unbearable to hear. The third verse described the raid, the agents surrounding the property in the pre-dawn darkness, the discovery of Samuel in the still house, the order to burn the building despite the boy's presence inside. This verse was the hardest to hear, its melody dropping into minor keys that seemed to carry the weight of an evil that words could not capture. The fourth verse described Samuel's death, his screams as the fire consumed him, his grandmother held back by agents who would not let her reach him, the moment when the screaming stopped and she knew that he was gone. The melody here was simply devastating, musicians reporting that audiences would sometimes leave rather than hear this verse performed. The fifth verse described the planning, Martha's decision to use her hogs as the instrument of her revenge, the preparations that occupied the weeks between Samuel's funeral and the first killing. The melody became darker here, the notes suggesting something ancient and implacable awakening. The sixth verse described the campaign itself, the agents disappearing one by one, the hogs consuming what Martha fed them, the investigation that found nothing because there was nothing to find. The melody had an almost mechanical quality here, suggesting the relentless efficiency of the method Martha had developed. The 7th verse described Crawford's death, the final 3 agents falling in the ambush that Martha had prepared, the completion of the vengeance that had claimed 19 lives. The melody was triumphant but terrible, the celebration of justice inseparable from the horror of its achievement. The final verse described Martha's remaining years, her death in the cabin where she had lived most of her life, her burial beside the grandson she had avenged. The melody resolved into something approaching peace, suggesting that even terrible deeds can find their proper ending, that even the most thoroughgoing vengeance must eventually rest. Musicians who performed this ballad reported that audiences responded with a complexity that reflected the story's moral weight. There was horror at the method Martha had employed, the consumption of human bodies by hogs, disturbing even to those who believed her cause was just. But there was also admiration for the completeness of her vengeance, the recognition that she had achieved something that no one else in the history of mountain justice had achieved. The elimination not merely of her enemies, but of every trace that they had ever existed. Another song focused specifically on the hogs, describing their breeding and their nature, the appetite that Martha had cultivated over 30 years, the capacity for consumption that made them the perfect instruments of disposal. This song had a darkly humorous quality that distinguished it from the main ballad, its verses describing the hogs in terms that made them almost sympathetic characters, creatures who were simply doing what their nature required. A third song told the story from the perspective of the investigators, imagining their frustration as they searched for evidence that did not exist, as they questioned suspects who would never talk, as they faced the wall of silence that the mountain community had maintained for generations. This song was almost sardonic, its melody suggesting the futility of pursuing justice through official channels when the community had already achieved its own. A fourth song addressed the question of what happened to the remains, noting that the hogs had been sold at markets throughout the county, that the buyers had consumed the meat without knowing its origin, that everyone in the region might have unknowingly participated in the disposal of the agents' bodies. This song was the most disturbing of all, its melody creating a discomfort that lingered long after the performance ended. A fifth song examined the ethics of Martha's method, asking whether the use of hogs for disposal made her vengeance more or less acceptable than other forms of killing, whether the elimination of evidence was a moral improvement over leaving bodies to be discovered, whether the completeness of her method changed the fundamental nature of what she had done. This song offered no answers, only questions that listeners were invited to consider. The historians who have studied the Martha of Harlan case have reached varying conclusions about its significance and meaning. Some have analyzed it as an example of resistance to federal overreach during Prohibition, arguing that the killings represented a response to an enforcement regime that had violated fundamental principles of proportionality and decency. The death of Samuel Blackwood was not merely a tragedy, but was a crime committed under color of law, and the community's response reflected its understanding that no official remedy would ever be provided. Others have focused on the method Martha employed, examining how her decades of raising hogs had given her knowledge that no one else possessed about their capacity for consumption. The hogs represented a unique capability, a method of disposal that was both effective and virtually undetectable, that allowed an elderly woman to eliminate evidence that other methods would have left behind. The forensic analysis has examined what the hogs could and could not have consumed, noting that complete elimination of human remains would have required careful preparation of the bodies before feeding and patient management of the consumption process over several days. Martha's method was not simply a matter of feeding bodies to hogs, but was a sophisticated process that she had developed through experimentation and that she had refined over the course of her campaign. The psychological analysis has examined Martha's state of mind, noting that the ability to process 19 human bodies through hogs over the course of 10 months would have required a sustained commitment that most people could not have maintained. Her willingness to do what the method required, day after day for nearly a year, suggested a determination that went beyond ordinary grief and into something that psychologists find difficult to categorize. The sociological analysis has examined the community's role in enabling Martha's campaign, noting that she could not have succeeded without assistance from family members and neighbors who knew what she was doing and chose to help rather than interfere. The conspiracy of protection extended to include dozens of people who provided information, assisted with operations, and maintained the silence that prevented prosecution. The agricultural analysis has examined the hog-raising practices of the period, noting that Martha's herd would have been unusual for its size, but not implausible given her reputation for prize-winning animals. The cover that her legitimate hog operation provided was essential to the success of her disposal method, allowing her to maintain a large herd without attracting suspicion about its purpose. You see, what Martha of Harlan did cannot be justified by any conventional legal or moral framework. She killed 19 men and fed their bodies to hogs, conducted a campaign of murder and disposal that lasted nearly a year, escaped prosecution only because her method left no evidence that could support charges. The fact that her victims had participated in her grandson's death does not eliminate the fact that she took 19 human lives in response to one. And yet her story cannot be simply condemned, reduced to a tale of murder that teaches only the obvious lesson that killing is wrong. Her grandson had been burned alive in a still house that agents had set on fire despite knowing he was inside, had died screaming while his grandmother was held back by the very men who were killing him, had been killed by federal agents who faced no consequences for what they had done. The system that was supposed to provide justice had instead protected the men who had murdered Samuel, had made clear through its inaction that the life of a mountain child meant nothing when weighed against the convenience of the state. The method Martha employed adds a dimension to this story that no other account of mountain vengeance possesses. The use of hogs for disposal was not merely efficient but was symbolically powerful, transforming the agents into the meat that they had tried to prevent her from producing, converting their bodies into a product that would be consumed by the very community they had tried to police. The poetic justice of the method was lost on no one who understood the story. The question of what happened to the remains is one that has troubled those who contemplate the case. The hogs that consumed the agents were sold at markets throughout Harlan County, were purchased by buyers who had no idea what the animals had been fed, were consumed as bacon and ham and pork chops by families throughout the region. The agents' remains were not merely disposed of, but were distributed throughout the community, everyone becoming an unwitting participant in the elimination of evidence. The descendants of Martha Blackwood still live in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, carrying memories passed down through generations about what their ancestor did and why. Family stories speak of Martha with a reverence that reflects both her role as grandmother and her role as avenger, the two identities inseparable in the memory of those who knew her. She is remembered as a woman who protected her family against every threat, who proved that the federal government's power had limits that even the most determined enforcement could not transcend. The prize hogs that the Blackwood family raises today are descendants of the animals that Martha bred, the bloodlines maintained through nearly a century of careful selection. The current generation of Blackwoods no longer uses the hogs for the purpose that Martha employed, but the knowledge of what the animals are capable of remains part of the family's history, a legacy that connects the present to a past that can never be entirely forgotten. The story of Martha of Harlan endures because it speaks to something fundamental in the human experience. It is the story of love between generations, of a grandmother's determination to avenge the grandson who was all she had left in the world. It is the story of method and patience, of the development of a disposal technique so complete that prosecution became impossible. It is the story of community solidarity, of a network of protection that shielded a killer from the consequences of her crimes because the community believed those crimes were justified. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand at Martha's grave, to read the inscription that promises she fed her family, to contemplate the life of a woman who transformed hog farming into an instrument of vengeance? Would you visit the property where the hogs still graze? Would you look into their eyes and wonder what their ancestors consumed? Would you try to understand how a grandmother becomes capable of what Martha did and what that capacity costs? The journey to Harlan County is easier now than it was in 1929. the roads paved and the connections to the outside world more numerous than they were when Martha Blackwood fed 19 revenue men to her prize hogs. But the mountains remain, ancient and patient, holding their memories close like they hold the morning mist and the evening shadows. The graves of grandmothers and grandsons rest in those mountains, their stories intertwined in ways that refuse to be untangled. The mountains keep their secrets, but not this one. The story of Martha of Harlan has been told and retold through generations, passed from parent to child, sung in ballads that still bring shivers to those who hear them. It is a story about what happens when the federal government kills a child and protects those responsible, when a grandmother decides that such a death cannot go unanswered, when prize hogs become the instruments of justice that no court would ever provide. It is a story that forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about evidence and disposal, about the limits of investigation, about what we would do if agents burned our grandchild alive and the government called it an accident. And that, my friend, is the true story of Martha of Harlan, who fed 19 revenue men to her prize hogs after they burned her still with her grandson inside, each victim disappearing without trace as the hogs consumed what she fed them, the campaign lasting 10 months and ending on the anniversary of Samuel's death, the evidence eliminated so completely that no prosecution was ever possible. Her story of a grandmother's love and a grandmother's fury, of patience and method applied to the darkest purpose, of prize hogs that consumed what they were given and left nothing behind. The mountains remember, and through them, so do we all.